Okay, so we'd call the meeting to order, is that right? 12:02. Do we need to introduce ourselves? Is that right, Onana? Yeah, okay. So Michelle Lefebvre, Exemption Committee Chair on the Big Island.
Onathon, Exemption Committee member.
Makala Kalmoana, Exemption Committee member.
They're from the Environmental Review Program, Tom Eisen, the planner, and
Mary Alice Evans, staff.
And there's some other staff in the blogosphere listening in also.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, the first item on the agenda was a review from April 4th. We realized, I think, at our last in-person meeting that we had some outstanding notes that hadn't been reviewed. So I sent those out, I think, immediately before this meeting. I don't think they were originally included in the attachments. Is that an issue, or can we?
Yeah, I think they need to be attached to the agenda.
Yep.
But I mean, the notes themselves were there, so I don't know if you want to just report on them or kind of look.
Sure.
You sent it this morning, Michelle?
When you asked for the attachments, I sent it thinking that they were part of the original agenda and attachments, but when I looked, I realized that I don't think I had sent them originally, so there was no embedded link for the April notes in the agenda that's on the publicly accessible. So do we have to pass on it, or we could talk about it and then put it on the agenda for next time and then pass them?
I think for any attachments that you want the council to review, it technically needs to be attached to the agenda, or that's at least a practice that we've been doing. I think if you want to report on it yourself, I mean, we just don't have the attachment for us, so.
Yeah, I mean, it was when we discussed the Hawaii School Facilities Authority list that we had a conversation with them. We were waiting for them to resubmit. They had not resubmitted as of the April meeting. So really the gist of the meeting was the new review process, which we actually started talking about before we called the meeting to order, which was just revising it to explain the process. Yeah, having the committee review it first before inviting the agencies was the gist of it. So that's when we discussed that. The new chairperson. So I think I was introduced at that time as being the chair. I think we voted it on a subsequent meeting, and then that was really it. There wasn't a lot of meat to it, mostly just the new review process for lists.
Okay.
But I will include it on next month's, or the next meeting's, next month's agenda, and I'll make sure to include the attachment.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, was it just the meeting minutes? That's what was the notes? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I do see it in the email that you sent on that, so sorry about that.
No.
You know, when you do your agenda, I think one thing that's helpful, and let me actually check your agenda before I say this, because you might have actually done it, is to add just like a bracket and a highlight to say, you know, please link here for things you want linked.
Okay.
Yeah, because then I think, or Tom, I don't know if that is helpful or not, but that's usually what I do just to make sure, like, hey, there's an attachment that goes with this item, you know, so
Track it through.
Yeah, maybe for future agendas, just so we know if something needs to be attached to a specific agenda item.
Okay, so nothing to approve at this point. We'll put it on, I'll add it to next month's agenda in terms of approving the April 4th notes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tom, I have to ask the question, but yeah, did you, is that helpful when Tom and Kim and folks, that we actually highlight like, hey, there's an attachment for this item? Or is it not?
It provides clarity, which is always good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It's hard when you're reading an agenda to keep track of kind of what all is saying. So I think it's clear.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff though. Okay, we'll do that.
We'll do. Okay, Okay, well, we received two lists, so we'll go through them first. One is a brand new list from the County of Hawaii Office of Housing and Community Development, which we can talk about first. And then second was the addition of one Part 1 exemption for State Hawaii Commission on Water Resource Management. So we can discuss that second. So first was the OHCD, Office of Housing and Community Development, new list. They very, very closely followed the Hawaii Housing Finance, HHFDC, and Development Corporation's list. So it is identical in many ways, particularly with the Part 1s. Where they differed was the addition of Part 2 actions for several of the exemption types. I emailed our contact about one in particular. I don't know, should we just jump into specifics, or did folks have an overall impression reading the list? I mean, I found that it was, it being very similar. Nothing major jumped out to me when I read the list. Or a
No.
couple of things I thought
Nor to me, Michelle, but what I will say is that in other lists that have water transmittal transportation in them, we have paid attention to size and scale of delivery systems to be sure that they're not increasing those sizes as Part 1, that they're replacing in kind, in the same. Obviously, if it's cracked, it needs to be fixed, but sometimes they're tempted to make it a bigger pipe when they do that.
Yeah,
not increasing capacity.
yeah, I think, I'm kind of on that same place for exemption type 2 and exemption type 3 with, the replacement of structures. Certain structures, okay, a shed, I'm cool with that being a Part 1. When we get it, I'm looking at page 4, a whole parking structure, maybe, I think it still should be exempt if it's the same, but maybe that's a Part 2 exemption, right? And so I think, kind of the bigger stuff, again, I think it's still valid, it qualifies for an exemption, but I think I'd like to see kind of the bigger stuff more in the Part 2, where they do, just a little bit of analysis and there's a record of what's being exempted. And I didn't get through the whole housing list, unfortunately. Sorry, I was having issues with the links this morning, but I did go through CRM list. I have a lot of those same comments where I think some things still would be fine as exemptions, but we want to see it as a Part 2 exemption. So
I
exemption, yeah, exemption type 2 and 3. I mean, I think we should take a little look at what's being replaced, and if it's, again, I don't know if this parking structure is 10 stalls, if it's, a 200 stall parking structure, yeah, maybe that's more of like a Part 2 exemption, right? So I think we can maybe refine it just a little bit more with the.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not saying don't do it.
Yeah, and they really followed. I mean, I guess I want to be conscious as well. If we approved it for HHFDC to be a Part 1, and now we're saying that's not a Part 1, we think it's a Part 2 now. When we approved the HHFDCs last year, November 2022, I think if maybe a significant amount of time had passed, we could say, oh, well, we're, these, we're thinking of these specific instances, but if
right. No, I agree. I think that's a really good point. So if you said all of these things are the same, I'm not inclined to go against what we've done in the past, because I think that causes more problems too.
Right. Yeah, parking structure was a type 1. They didn't have it bulleted out. The list for HHFDC was just, it was written out instead of bulleted.
Yeah.
But parking structures
in
was
there.
Yeah.
And I think that, this agency, okay, they're probably doing stuff in like urban district lands more so maybe a little bit less of a concern, right? Than if there's an agency doing stuff in lands that aren't. So yeah, I guess I'll take that back. We don't need to tell them to switch it, since we we already approved that in another list, but yeah, for certain, like C-worms, I had kind of those same questions, like maybe that stuff is more of a part two than a part
Okay.
one for the list. Yeah. Okay.
Is there a potential for at least making that comment that not saying, you know, we're doing this because we did it before, but saying, you know, we are concerned about the qualities or aspects of a part two. We're not saying you have to do it, but this kind of activity does warrant, you know, a good review of some sort. You know, I mean, I don't know how to, yeah, we're kind of stuck if we approved it before, but I found water kinds of things and housing kinds of things to be complex because I really believe in their mission and what they're trying to do. I'm not trying to, you know, make their life difficult, but I am needing to be sure that they're not slipping one past us. Not that that's what they're trying to do, but just, you know, we need to really start thinking about, and we are thinking about these kinds of resources, you know.
I didn't notice anything about water. I wasn't specifically thinking of water. I'm glad you brought it up. They did seem very conscious in their part two actions about, you know, and I didn't know if 20% was a percentage that, you know, is common that we'd seen before in other lists, but they were conscious of increasing capacity, not increasing capacity above 20%. So it seemed that they were conscious that when they were talking about construction, rehab, or acquisition of new facilities, that, you know, we're talking about rehab of like, not of something twice as big, right? So, but I'm glad you brought up the water, and it's something I can make sure they addressed. But they seemed conscious of that in their list. And I mean, maybe there's a way to capture this concern. They only had like for the exemption type 2 replacement and reconstruction, you know, they added one part 2 action. I don't think that HHFDC did have the same part 2 action, but maybe there's something we could request that they add in there, that it, you know, anything above a certain, you know, if you're increasing capacity more than or between this percent and that percent, that it falls under a part 2. Maybe we can think about that.
I think it's hard for us to make the determination on the percentage because it is going to be so agency specific. And like I said, I mean, if they're doing stuff in the middle of downtown Honolulu versus, you know, adjacent to active ag fields or something, right? I mean, that analysis kind of changes, but you know, Tom, I guess I kind of have a question for you in terms of like what you guys do for agency education, because to me this almost feels like, listen, we've approved lists in the past, we know you followed another list, we're going to keep with what we've approved, but you know, we do urge the agencies to, even though it's a part 1 exemption, you don't have to do a full exemption determination, maybe to just keep some internal record of it. And you know, I mean, presumably somebody's kind of thinking about it a little bit, right? I mean, I guess, yeah, what advice do you give agencies in kind of this situation?
The general advice is that if you're going part 1, then it's a very minimal paper trail that you're probably creating, if any. And so be prepared that you've got nothing to back you up if you get challenged. So only use that in cases where you're absolutely sure that you won't be challenged, because part 1 is kind of designed for super quick and easy things.
Right.
So, you know, to give it some context, I can't say the content, what should be 1 or what should be 2, but just when you're thinking about dividing it or using a de minimis thing, it should be for things that you feel very confident aren't going to get challenged.
Yeah, I think that's good guidance. And Michelle, maybe we can do that when we meet with them, just kind of saying, hey, listen, as we continue to do more and more of these lists, and even for us, it's a learning process, right? So we think about it a little bit more. But I mean, if you're having a question, is it a shed or is it like a full maintenance facility, right? If you're kind of questioning it, then maybe that's a part 2, right? Even if it's something that's kind of listed on part 1. And yeah, I agree. I think it's in the agency's best interest to keep some kind of documentation and even putting it on the list that goes to ERP for publication, right? Because that's how folks are notified about, you know, this is what happened, and you start your 120-day clock on the challenge, right? So yeah, maybe we do it that way so we can still stay consistent with what we've done in the past. But yeah, our education to agency should be like, yeah, if you're questioning it, then maybe that's more of a part 2 situation. Right.
I would say if you're giving it really any thought at all of what it should be, that probably means it's a part 2.
Right.
Part 1 should be so obvious. And also the idea that usually for part 1, I'm assuming it's not being documented either in their files with a standard notice, and it's not being included on the monthly list. So there is no discovery that happens prior to, you know, that the action occurring. And so are you prepared to be hit with a challenge at that point?
Mm-hmm.
Think about that if you're going to go with type 1.
Right.
And that would be my, I mean, if I don't want it, but if I was in your seat, I would be saying, you're the ones that know your community. You're the ones that know, you know, which issues are going to, you know, draw scrutiny or attention, or might be sensitive, you know, and maybe scale wise, it's not a part 2, but maybe part 2 just saves you a lot of grief.
Yeah, it's as much kind of that damage control.
Yeah.
Thinking about that, you know, how it could blow up. I advise that, yes.
So have you had that instance, Tom, where somebody publishes a part 1 action?
I'm sure it's probably happened. I don't think it's much, but I have to say, I don't go through the list with the fund.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, because when you list the type of exemption, you know, would you be listing out?
Yeah, I think people aren't publishing part 1. That's kind of the point.
That would
Right.
be new, that would be new guidance, right? To say, you should be publishing a part 1 if you think it's.
Well, I think we wouldn't say you should be publishing a part 1. I think at that point we would just categorize it as a part 2. I mean, essentially do a for that action, right? We're just saying you have to do an exemption determination, because what our rules really say is that for these really, you know, these actions that are so administrative or so, you know, no impacts, right? We'll classify those as part 1, but for the ones where it's maybe a question, you have to do an exemption determination, and that's a part 2, and that gets published. So yeah, I think it might get too confusing where we say, well, we're gonna treat it as a part 2. I mean, we're treating the publishing part. It's more of like a CYA for the agency, because Tom is right. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing with the exemptions, why it was kind of tough for folks, because it's 120 days from when the public knows or when they become aware of the action. That's what it was before, right? So by publishing in the notice, what we're trying to do is like that's published to the public, and so people know. So you're not finding an exemption determination or that an action was done, you know, months later, and then your 120 days starts from there. So yeah, I guess that's a little confusing. I mean, basically say generally these types of actions would fall under a part 1, but if you're having a serious question because it's such a large facility, or you've increased the capacity so much, that probably would make it a part 2, and you know, you should just treat it as a part 2 exemption and do an exemption determination and publish it.
You know, the other piece of that potentially is, yes, this is a little shed. Yes, this is a small whatever, but now it's located next to something new and different. You know, another, you know, there's other stuff around it kind of thing, so that specific task isn't a big deal, but it might be, in my perception, cumulative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, they have to be smart about this. They want to CYA. They don't want to, you know, cause the grief. And so, you know, I think we just make sure that we're offering them, reminding them that they have that flexibility, and that it's not going to be that onerous to do a part 2, and it might save them a lot of cost and time and grief down the road.
Right, agreed.
Yeah,
So-
and really, I think scale and context are very important for any specific item that can make all the difference of whether part one or part two, or even no exemption is relevant.
Right.
To be very aware of that.
Matters to me. That's what I'm looking, if something else is lit up and then this happens, in the same vicinity, mentally I'm putting the two together, whether they belong together or not.
To get in the weeds of this particular, thinking about structures, thinking about, warehouses, sheds, parking structures. Right now, the way that the part one is written for exemption type 2, part 1 action, it's to replace or reconstruct structures or facilities necessary to meet, federal, state, and local codes. That's, part 1, and then it goes into the structures. And, the type 2 is defined by substantially have the same purpose, capacity, density, height, and dimension. So, that's defined by the type we're in. And then part 1 is, all these activities. Part 2 for the same is to replace or reconstruct existing structures in shoreline areas. So it's this part 2 for this exemption type is very specific to shoreline. So say, to use the example of a parking structure, they came in with a parking structure. They're like, is it the same capacity, or is it just a little bit more? Like maybe this really is this particular project falls more under a part 2 action, but the part 2 action for this type is defined specifically for shoreline areas. So
that makes me nervous. Yeah, and I actually wanted, I don't know if Michelle, if you have our history, because I know, so they specifically excluded seawall work from the part 1. I thought we had in past lists excluded seawalls period from exemption, but I don't, is that something we can check? And I know Ron will know, and hopefully he'll be able to make the next meeting. But, if they're doing any work in the shoreline area, I mean, realistically, I think OCCL is going to make them do an EA.
If
So
not the public.
yeah. So I am a little, I mean, again, you're replacing existing structures. It may already be covered, right, under past stuff for this particular, if it's replacing the exact same structure in the exact same place. I think law with seawalls, like you can't even modify it actually, technically.
You can't replace the same structure in the
Yeah.
shoreline that's shifting. It doesn't work like that. You're trying to put a pipe back where a pipe was in the shoreline district. The shoreline's different. It's Malka.
Let's check what we did for seawalls in the past, because I don't know.
I think we said no exemption.
No exemption period, right? Did we?
That's what I remember.
The category of being too sensitive of an area.
Yeah. Okay, but I do, Michelle, if we can check what we've done in the past, and Ron will probably know off the top of his head, so you don't have to do too much research. But let's definitely come back to this one in the part 2 exemption type 2 part 2 on page 6, because again, I think we've told folks in the last few years, like, you just know seawalls on the exemption period. But
again,
yeah.
I remember it coming up, I think, on some of my first meetings as well, seeing your guys' review of those lists. So, I mean, I recall you guys bringing that up. So, again, it's a copy from HHFDC, which has that text in it. So there's the seawall issue, but there's also the other issue that the part 2 action, the only type is really this replace or reconstruct in shoreline. And so I guess it's, do we want another category? Do we want to, you know what I mean? This sort of, if the agency's feeling is that, this is the kind of thing they would want to share with the public, right? They want to publish it, through ERP. Like, there's not really a category for that in this part 2 action for replacing a structure that isn't in the shoreline area.
What's stopping them? What's stopping them?
I think if they wanted to, they could. Because the way it works, right, is they just send Tom their list of what their part 2 actions is. ERP doesn't say yes or no.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when we give them advice, we should let them know, like, hey, again, if you guys are having a question, anything that you even have in part 1 that you think might be a part 2, you know, you should include that on your list, right? Of whoever's preparing.
So I guess that's what I'm asking. Since the part 2 is very specifically about shoreline, should the part 2 be broader for this exemption type than just shoreline, so that it can encompass more than just work within a shoreline area?
Well, this is just my opinion. I don't think they need to say that on their list for them to publish something. Like if they're, you know what I mean? Because
Just generally speaking, any
Yeah,
exemption type,
because-
any activity.
yeah, because they're also not restricted to exempting things on their list, right? They can, as long as it fits into the types of exemptions that are allowed in the rules, they can.
in the rules. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter whether or not it's on their list. The list, so if it's not on their list, it's automatically, you treat it as part 2 for publication purposes, right? The benefit of doing the list is so that you can figure out what's your part 1 and part 2, so that you don't have to publish the part 1 stuff. And also that you have a little bit more credibility, or you know, it's essentially your list has been peer reviewed by the EAC, right? It's been concurred. So that's the benefit of the list, but agencies aren't restricted. So I don't think we need to add any language, but if they're going to exempt something that's not on their list, then it would need to be published. It wouldn't need to be a regular exemption determination, essentially treated as a part 2 exemption. So yeah,
Even here, I will tell you that, you know, where certain agencies have had signage, for example, door or other kinds of signage that's always been in this one place, and they've said, yeah, we're going to put that back. I said, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're putting it in harm's way. You're putting it in the water. You're wasting taxpayer money. You're not, you know, da. No, it can't go back there. There's not there. So a simple example like that, you know, where are you going to put it? Well, now I care, you know, again, where you can put it. So it becomes a thing, but it's not my fault, you know, somebody's fault. It's not my fault. You know, the river's rising.
Okay. Well, I think that if we're gonna, yeah, I think we can make that point in a general way to them without having to, yeah, be explicit in the individual parts. But okay,
yeah, I don't think they need to add text to their lists to handle that. They should be educated and aware of this is kind of the analysis that you should do, determining how you treat it, whether it's part 1 or part 2.
Okay. All right. And for, let's see.
So that Michelle, the one we were just talking about how that was the new addition, the difference. That was the one thing that was different.
That was not different. No, that was the same. That replace or reconstruct existing structures in shoreline areas
It's the same.
is the same as HHFDC.
Okay, so we did let that one go?
At least in 2022 for HHFDC, yes.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk to Ron about that, because maybe having
that doesn't seem right. It doesn't
mean we have to do that this time, because I think enough has changed and enough, you know, that we can point to and say, look, you know, that's not the case anymore. And you know,
well, it's the old adage of when you know better, you do better. But 2022 was not that long ago, and we all knew about sea level rise.
That, but okay.
I'd be interested to know, because that would have glowed in the dark for me.
Right. Then in the type 3 exemptions, they did add a bit new. So type 3 construction and location of single new facilities. They added under part 2, under construction of new facilities and structures, they added congregate mailboxes and adjoining sidewalks. Which doesn't seem like a big issue. That wasn't in HHFDC's. And then everything that follows, so 2 through 11 on pages 8 and 9 of the OHCD list was new. And here I think you know, they tried to capture, I think what you were saying, Maka'ala, about, you know, capacity, in terms of defining how many units, or, you know, percent change in density. I didn't see any issues there. I did email them about number 5. So at the bottom of page 8, I just thought potentially a reword of that part 2 action. The way it's written now, it says rehabilitation of non-residential structures that would not result in a change in size and capacity of more than 20% and not involve changes in land use, but include, but not limited to, the following. I
Right.
had a little trouble following
The knots and the, yeah.
there. So I emailed it, or them, I haven't heard back yet to clarify. I think they want to say rehabilitation of non-residential structures, including the bulleted list below, that don't result in a change in size and capacity and don't involve change in land use. I think if they just reorganize that, it'll be a little bit easier to follow.
But I would like, but I'm not sure, do we want and or do we want or?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just, you know,
Mhm.
I don't know that one would occur without the other, but I'm
Yeah.
just,
I think they would want an or, so.
Mhm.
yeah, I would think they'd want an or.
Okay.
And I'm happy to, I'm fine with that. I just, you know, some of this stuff is going to get picked up anyway, and they're going to be doing EAs anyhow. So, you know, it's just the sensitivity of the public is, you know, pretty heightened these days.
Yeah.
And this one, interestingly, the second to last bullet does exclude the replacement or construction of new seawalls. So
Yeah, see, that's the language that I thought we had, that we just excluded it.
Right.
So period.
Yeah.
So that makes sense, but
Mhm.
for it to be a part 2 exemption under,
Type 2. Mhm.
again, that's an existing, right? Because and this may have to do with the new seawalls versus maintaining existing, right?
Right.
So yeah.
On number 8 on the next page, on page 9, I just thought maybe the addition of the word existing, I know I think it's baked into the type, but essential infrastructure and public utility services extensions to serve existing structures or facilities. I don't think we're talking about constructing new. Maybe I'm wrong.
We just ask them what they mean by
Yeah,
it.
maybe that's just to clarify. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by that congregate mailboxes trip.
Why is that fascinating?
Well, there's a certain point at which a wall of mailboxes becomes a thing. You know, it becomes a sort of a quasi structure. You know what I'm saying? I mean, 4 is fine, but you know, I mean, I don't know what it means. Anyway, I don't care enough to argue about it, but I just, you know, I have seen banks of mailboxes in rural communities, for example, in parts of the continent that are formidable.
Right.
Having never been a mail delivery person, I'm sure I can't relate to the efficiency of that.
Then wanted to get Onana your thoughts, and Maka'ala too, on exemption type 6 on page 12. We talk about abandoned in the part one actions, demolition of structures, facilities. This is the same. I believe it's the same as part one, demolition. Is there like is there a legal definition of abandoned, or is that? I mean, this is the same phrasing as HHFTC. I just
For certain statutes there are, but it's not going to be just one definition, right? So,
right.
Are they talking about their facilities? Maybe we get them to clarify stuff that's on or that they own. I don't think they're, well, actually, I'll take that back because, yeah, it does say haunted property.
Yeah. And those are identical to HHFDC, so we don't have to change it. I just
Yeah.
I missed this before, but I'm now seeing, and I'm confused. The same one, exemption type 6, demolition of structures, and they've included reservoirs. And I don't think that's right.
Where do you see that?
A.
Oh, A, yeah. HHC had it.
In
Well,
their
that may be, I don't know how many reservoirs they have, but I just listed on the National Register of Hawaii Register of Historic Places, or Hawaii Register of the demolition of structures, except those that are on this. So quick, everybody, run and register your reservoirs. I don't want them to take our reservoir away, and we're fighting for it hard. I don't want that to be easy for them to do.
So Michelle, in the HHFDC list, it has the same word reservoir, demolition of reservoirs under part 1.
Yes.
They have reservoirs?
Structures such as buildings, sheds, warehouses, storage.
I know, but HHFDC has reservoirs?
Correct.
No, I mean, do they actually own them is what I'm saying.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Do they actually have them?
I don't know.
I'm nervous. I'm nervous, nigh on to paranoid about reservoirs at this point, because I think we're functioning in fear, and I'm trying to, trying to have us take a breath and make sure that we fully considered implications of retention and of removal. And I didn't know HHFDC owned any reservoirs, but I guess they might. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. I mean, I don't even know who owns all these. I know who owns the reservoirs on Kauai, but I don't know who owns all the other reservoirs.
Why don't we ask them what size their reservoirs are? Because I almost feel like we did talk about this. Maybe it was for the HHFDC list, and Ron will have a better recollection about, what are the size of the reservoirs that they're talking about, right?
Yeah, is it just like a, yes, exactly, Onana. That was my first thought, are they just talking about a concrete holding tank of some sort, and we're calling it a reservoir? Because a reservoir can be, 1 cup to, 1 million gallons or more. So
yeah, so maybe that's a question back to them. We want to talk about this one a little bit more. Can you guys describe, what size reservoirs they're made out of? Are these, are they just concrete tanks above grade, or are they, in the ground kind of reservoirs situations?
Right. And if I mean, who would own it? They're going to take out something that doesn't belong to them?
So I mean, it depends, right? Their lands that they manage, or if they have a permit come through them, right? So sometimes it could be their property, both property they own, but also property they don't own, or if somebody else, an applicant's doing an action on their land, right? So, yeah.
Well, this could be problematic because it has so many potential. I mean, it may be nothing, but it may be not.
Yeah, let's get a little bit more information. Now my memory is kind of jogging. I know we've had a similar conversation about reservoirs and even for other structures right on other lists. We're like, well, okay, agency, tell us what you do, because again, not all agencies are doing the same type of work, right?
Mhm.
And some are in different areas. So maybe it's okay for one agency, but for another agency, we'll probably ask some other questions.
Okay, all right.
I'm fascinated that an agency owns a reservoir other than DLNR or, you know, I mean, I'm
Mhm.
interested. I'm interested in that concept altogether.
Right. And then in that same part one actions, they added everything under number 2. So that 2A, B, C, D on pages 12 and 13 are all new, not in HHFDCs. So additional sort of demolition categories.
You're big on this mailbox thing.
Under 2A, demolition of retaining walls and other slope stabilization structures gets me a little nervous for part 1.
Which one? Sorry, the demolition of.
For 2A, buildings and structures, demolition of retaining walls and other slope stabilization structures. I don't know how big a slope. I mean, if these are just housing related for like individual lots, maybe not a big issue, but
So, you know,
that's-
part one,
that's questions on that.
yeah, part one, number 1 is all about at abandoned, right? At facilities, equipment, impounded property, or other improvements that are abandoned. And part 2 is this doesn't have abandoned, right? So it's demolition or removal of structures, equipment, etc. Facilities at impounded property. So this other category of sort of not abandoned things is what they've added.
Yeah, and the abandoned nature doesn't
Yeah.
really change for me. It doesn't give me any pause because it's the structure, right?
Mhm.
More so.
You didn't think that needs, I mean, just because it's got the sort of category above that it doesn't need to be, you know, obsolete or end of functional life or broken. I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter.
Redeveloping something, right?
Yeah.
And you gotta demo something else to put something new up. So
Yeah.
I mean, if that was the case, they probably consider, you know what I mean? If you trigger 343 on the new stuff, you're gonna consider the demo part within that document anyways.
Right.
Presumably. Or if just like a project comes to its end of life and it needs to be, you know, decommissioned or right. I mean,
Sure.
so that's yeah.
So you're concerned about demoing the retaining walls?
I mean, I guess I just want to understand more like how big of a retaining wall are we talking about and like soap structures, because I mean, I don't know what kind of slopes are they're holding
Yeah.
up. Yeah. So maybe again, maybe that's a part 2 thing, but if they're gonna demo a retaining wall on a slope stabilization structure, then like what happens? Because why did you need the retaining wall and the slope stabilization stuff in the first place? I guess if, you know, I mean, like if it's gonna be graded down, then okay. But I'm just curious in what situation that would occur.
You come at that reservoir thing again too. D, infrastructure and utilities, water collection, distribution systems, storage tanks, reservoirs. They just may be playing loose and light with the word reservoir, and I'm thinking, you know, reservoir.
Yeah, it could be something very small. So I think that's why we just go back with a question instead of saying.
Right. No, I don't want to make assumptions, but I do want them to know that we're paying attention to that.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're seeing that under, sorry, you said D?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, reservoirs.
Do we have any issues on now with the fuel one? Are we paranoid enough about that?
I mean,
they'd have to comply with whatever, right?
well, yeah,
one would have thought.
Whatever DOH says to.
One would have thought.
Yeah. I mean, DOH could still require something, right? If they're gonna, like, if you're decommissioning like an underground storage tank and whatnot, there's specific requirements for that, right?
Yeah, but we should be helping, where we're able and not,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
not making DOH, do all of the heavy lifting here. I mean, we should help when we can.
Because the part two does cover, structures that require further consideration because of their potential impact on the surrounding communities. For example, demo of things that contain high levels of hazardous materials. So, I mean, it could definitely fall within that part two.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's kind of like a catch-all, the way they have their part two.
We can just ask them to.
Except that we don't know what they are, except that they've listed all the others above as
Yeah.
part one, and then, you know what I'm saying?
But we can
No,
recommend,
I
right? They
understood.
need
I mean, I think they gotta, again, if they're asking themselves a question, like maybe this is a little intense, maybe it's part of a part two, right? So,
Yeah. I guess we just ask them to consider moving the fuel under that hazardous material category in part two.
right.
I mean, that seems like a pretty
I
reasonable.
think that would be wise for them at this point.
Yeah. Okay. And
Unless
again,
they,
we
again, if
ask,
they think
ask them the
very,
question, have them explain
Mhm.
what kind of capacity is it, like one propane tank for like a
Right.
group, or are we
Right.
talking about, large, is this like a Red Hill thing? Yeah, yeah. So, okay.
How nervous can we make them? Is this like a Red Hill thing?
We don't say that, but
Yeah, I know, that's why I was giggling.
yeah, we just want to understand, how the scale
The
of it.
scale of it, yes, and it's hard. We don't want them to be so detailed in this thing that it gives us migraines, but we do need some parameters.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Again, we can have a conversation with them that says this is how you should use the list, but to the extent that the text is in here, then it helps guide not just the people we've spoken to, right, but planners that come later at those agencies. So if it's in the list, then it can help guide that.
And we don't want it too broadly open to their individual interpretation of somebody that comes along after and doesn't have any sensitivity to what happened.
Right. So part 7, zoning variances. That whole part 2 section is new. So
yeah, I think that's fine.
okay.
They want to put that under part 2. Depending on the variance itself, I mean, the variance application, right? I mean, maybe they have a traditional trigger, then they have a traditional trigger.
Right.
Yeah, because I guess we'll talk to him like, hey, if you guys are, I mean, so if you're getting a variance for like a planned use development that otherwise triggers 343, I mean, you're gonna consider the sidewalks and the ramps and the bridges and the stuff that's proposed with it, right? So yeah, I mean, they wouldn't pull those elements out, presumably, to exempt those elements, right? I mean, I guess if they're just doing these things, then okay.
And then type 8, they just added number 11, which is continuing government administrative actions. So they wanted that explicitly in there.
That's fine.
Just the type that it is, but yeah. And then exemption type 9, numbers 2 through 4 are new. And wondered if you guys had thoughts on transfer of title to real property, acquisition but not improvement of real property for public use, or creation or termination of easements, covenants, or other rights in real property.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. And then 11, they modified it. I think they just added real property. The term before it said, acquire interest. This one said acquisition of real property and interests. They also added quit claim. And I think part 10 was identical. So no,
Would
no
you
change.
explain to me that language in the one we just did on after the 11 that you just described, number 12, demise retaining walls? What does that mean?
Yeah, that, I mean, like when you it's kind of like granting an interest in something too, right? So if you were to like lease it or sell it, so I guess if they're just selling, so all of this is just, yeah, acquisition, sales, that's fine. You're not doing anything, any
I don't
like,
understand the use of the word demise there, Alana. Demise means dead. I don't know. What's that?
no, there's a different term. I mean, I know we use it in granting. It's a conveyance. It just means conveyance or transfer of
Okay.
property.
Okay, I've never heard it used that way. Okay, thank you.
Me either. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're nearing the end, so I think we should for this item, I think we've come up with a list of questions, so I think we can invite OHCD to our next meeting and talk through that with them. Do we need a motion for that?
Well, we're not asking for action from the council.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so the other item was Seaworms, one addition to a part one.
Interject, just to be very mindful of the time, then.
Yep.
Full committee is supposed to meet in 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
So for Seaworm, and maybe this, if we need more time, we can take it, but it's the addition of the class 3 part 1, number 7.
Yeah, I kind of feel, I mean, is that typically a part 1 thing or should that be a part 2? Pump capacity up to 40 gallons per minute. Yeah, maybe that's not much and
It's very little.
little, okay. So maybe part 1 is okay then for that. I did have, there's a couple of just cleanup stuff on page 1. The first sentence, they say this was prepared in compliance with 2019 revisions to HAR 11-200. I mean, I think they should just say 11-200.1. In the next paragraph, they say environmental council. It should just be environmental advisory council. Yeah, there's a few that I had questions on. And I can just go through them real quick. So maybe Michelle, in case you wanted to reach out to them before the next meeting. But part 1, exemption class 2, part 1, number 3, replacement or reconstruction of existing structures and facilities, including base yards, offices, cabins, sheds, and fencing. Again, I was like, maybe that's more of a part 2 situation. But the question back to them is like, what kind of structures, where are your guys' structures located? Because yeah, if it's in a conservation district, maybe again, you know, OCCO might require them to do some stuff. Part 2, they said construction of on state lands or roadways with distances less than 1,000 yards and walkways. So maybe it should be roadways and walkways with distances less than 1,000 yards.
Sorry, you're on page.
Page. They should add page numbers, but it's page 3. Also another comment. But the exemption class 2, part 2, construction on state lands of roadways. I think it should say roadways and walkways with distances of less than 1,000 yards. And then also, I guess 1,000 yards, that's not that long. I mean, so are they doing an EA for everything greater than 1,000 yards?
So I'm sorry, I didn't double check when this list was approved or concurred with. Because they were only asking about the one addition. But I mean, that isn't to say we can't talk about other things, but
yeah, I don't think they submitted a list several months back. We gave some comments and then never came back.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize that was Seaworm. Okay.
Yeah. So
I didn't read the whole thing.
Seaworm folks come. So actually, I have to check my notes on that on when we went back. But as I was just looking through this, so maybe we got to do another meeting on this one.
Yeah, I didn't actually read it from beginning to end. I thought we were just looking at the one in red.
Because I don't think we sent them a lot of questions and then I think they just didn't.
Oh, okay.
I
Okay.
gotta go
yeah.
back and check, and I know Ron will know like what were the things that we had issues with. So
So maybe
Yeah,
I will
I
invite them.
would like another meeting on this one. This
Okay.
one deserves
Let's
our
do that.
full
Sorry,
attention.
I didn't realize the history, so I will not be reaching out to CWORM to attend our
Okay.
next one, but I
Okay.
will for OHCD. Okay, and I think we have to bring
hold
this
on.
to a close.
Yeah, I'm gonna go run to the restroom real quick and then I'll be
Okay,
back.
thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank
Good
you, Michelle. Thank you.
All right. Okay, bye-bye.
You know,
Bye-bye.
in a
Adjourn.
moment.
Yeah, 12:58.